This Deuteronomy scripture is one of my two favorites in the Old Testament. I love how the image of bringing an offering into the temple and having to recite, my ancestors were wandering Arameans. And those few verses, those 11 verses, sums up all of Genesis, all of Exodus, takes about half of the entire Old Testament, is right there in those few verses. And I often wonder, and this has been one of the blessings of being called into the ministry, is how did I get here? How did I get to be here this morning? It's a strange route that took so many twists and turns that from each time I barely knew what was going on. But looking back, I can trace being here all the way back, and I think this is unusual for a lot of people, but I can trace it back to either kindergarten or first grade. I know the choir is not going to believe this, but my kindergarten teacher or my first grade teacher, for a parents program, the teacher selected me to be the conductor. I know, yeah. So I stood up there and did something with my hands and arms, probably a lot like this, and had no idea what I was doing, but everybody applauded. And, I was comfortable in front of a group of people. And that's the earliest that I can trace it back to the first step of how did I get here. It really, and that one time of music, leading music, 55 years later, the bell choir director at Community UCC in Elkhart Lake asked me to lead the bell choir for just a couple of minutes. She had to make a phone call, and I asked her what to do, and she said, just count out loud, 1 to 4, and then back to 1 again. And I said, okay, I can do that. And she said, good, because the choir will do whatever they want, and if you make a mistake, they'll cover for you. So I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1. That's counting to 5. That and is 5. So even 55 years later, I still couldn't do it. How did we get here? What are our paths? I know a little bit about my path, and even that is complicated. My grandfather was adopted, so prior to that, I don't really know very much. It's just conjecture. Beginning with my father, I know a whole lot more about how I got here. Even that is filled with unknowns and twists and turns that affected me before, even before I was born. What is your path? How did you come to be here today? What is it that you give thanks to God for? What are those times when you stood up for something and that made a difference in your life, when you found the courage to do something that you weren't quite sure you had the courage to do, but you stood up for a principle, stood up for God, stood up for a family member, and people looked at you and went, wow, I wish I could have done that. Or, I know now that given that opportunity, I'd do the same thing. Do we give thanks to God for those moments in our lives? Those times when we come to God with an offering, the first fruits from the ground, Lord, you gave me this. You gave me this ground, and this is what I have done with it. I have provided food for my family. I have provided food for the community. I have provided food for myself. I have taken the gifts that you have given me and I have made them better. I have used your gifts for the betterment of the community. I personally think that during our time of offering that we should be required to repeat this because it's so fundamental to who we are today. We may not be able to name our great-grandparents and say where they came from, but in one sense it really doesn't matter because they passed along things to our grandparents and then to our parents, and they passed along those experiences and those values to us, and we will pass along our experiences to our kids. In my family, it's a running joke that if I tell any story about the Navy, my daughter rolls her eyes and says, yes, 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 40 years ago when you were in the Navy. To me, the stories that I pass along are really, really important because there's a meaning behind those stories. They formed me in some way. Bible stories form us in certain ways. We value parts of our life more than others because of things we hear in the stories of the gospel. We are to know as much about our stories as we can. What is it that called you to be you? What is it that has called... Oh, Grace is gone. What is it that called Grace to be in confirmation class? Was it her parents forcing her? Did she want to on her own accord? Has she learned something in that confirmation class that has made a difference? And the reading from Luke, where Jesus is being tempted, that's a tough story for me. And I know it, and I pass that along to my kids. And Jesus was in the desert for 40 days, and he didn't eat anything. You know, one of the moments most recent in my past is when my wife was in the hospital, and she had an unexpected complication after surgery, and the nurses asked me if I wanted to leave the room, and I said, no, I'm staying here. They asked me about a half a dozen times, and I said, no, I'm staying here. Now, in the back of my mind, I knew full well that if if they had wanted to get me out of there, all a nurse had to do was stand in the hallway with a bag of peanut M&Ms and just said, look what I've got. And I would have said, I'm married to who? I don't do so well with the temptations. I do well with understanding how my parents formed me and my school experiences formed me, and experience as an adult led me here. But I tell you, I have trouble with the temptation. Peanut M&Ms, chocolate chip cookies, I would be in serious trouble trying to avoid some of those. Now, for others, you may think, chocolate chip cookie? How could anybody be tempted by that? It's part of our story. It is part of who we are. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. My kids can probably say a chocolate chip cookie addict was my ancestor. He would wander far and wide for a chocolate chip cookie. He would steal chocolate chip cookies, which I've done, from the youth group. They made some great chocolate chip cookies. Oh my gosh. Enough so that they made 12 dozen for sale for the next spring. This was in the fall. When they went to the refrigerator to get them out, there was less than a dozen. Yeah, I have trouble with temptation when it comes to chocolate chip cookies. I admit that. It's a silly part of who I am, of how I got here. But I understand that it's important to who I am. Who is it that God has formed you to be through your life experiences? Marriage, kids, elementary school, high school, jobs. Take time this week to figure that out. Who are you? How did you get here? And it can be as simple as physically, how did you get here to New Holstein? But deeply, how did you get here? How did you get here in your life? For kids, you may not be able to look back and understand that for many years, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating the way that things have touched you that to someone else may not have meant anything. Look at how God has formed you so that when you bring an offering to God, whether that's an offering here on Sunday morning or the offering of your life, the offering of a word, the offering of courage, the offering of peace, acknowledge that. Acknowledge that as an offering that you bring before God. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. A wandering teacher was my ancestor. A wandering nurse was my ancestor. A wandering Sunday school teacher was my ancestor. A wandering history teacher was my ancestor. A wandering chief petty officer in the Navy was my ancestor. A wandering husband, so that's not going to come out right. My husband was no, I just can't put that with wandering. He influenced me. Okay, yeah. My wife influenced me. Can't say the wandering there. It doesn't come out right. Figure out that story and pass it along. Pass it along to your kids. Tell your husband or your wife about it. You'll be laughing about some of the stories, but that's how God formed you. That is how God has formed you. And the people that held up these bells this morning and can make music with them, God has touched their lives through music. I have no gift. If God formed me with music, God did it. I didn't pay attention. But I know, as part of me, that although I can't play an instrument, I don't understand the theory behind the music, I know that listening I can be transformed from a person who is stressed out to a person who is calm. Sandy playing her various instruments that she brings, and Linda with the organ, and the choir on Sunday morning, the bell choir on Sunday morning, can take somebody who is stressed, who is worried about his wife, and those disappear. It's a gift and a blessing and an influence on my life that they may not know. How did I get here? Through a lot of love from God, from other people, from people that may not have even noticed, and tell them how I got here. I try and tell people how they influenced me. Tell your kids. Tell your spouse. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor.